I just never want to forget this feeling of gratitude for the beauty of this area. And also, I never want to forget how much I felt called and how much I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
Today, we're going to do something that I've really been looking forward to. We're going to take some time, Ricky and myself, to talk about and consider a fellow named George A. Hicks, who was one of the original pioneers who came to Utah's Dixie and became quite famous, maybe infamous in some ways, as he wrote a song called Once I Lived in Cottonwood. And we sometimes refer to it as I Was Called to Dixie. That song has continued through the ages since he wrote it in the 1860s and is now our theme for the Not Forgotten podcast. And we wanted to share a little bit of the story of George Hicks and his wife Elizabeth, whom he called Betsy, and talk about the song, how it came to be, and maybe a little bit about the aftermath of the song as well. George Hicks was born in Ontario, Canada in 1835, and his parents joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1837. So they were very early converts to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And they were in Nauvoo from its beginning until the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints in 1846. And then they were in Pottawatomie County, Iowa for several years until 1852. And that's when they crossed the plains and came to Utah. They came to the Salt Lake Valley, and they took up property in a farm in Cottonwood in the Salt Lake Valley. And when I say they, when George arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, he met Elizabeth, he met Betsy, and they were later married in what became Spanish Fork in 1853. And then they had their home and their farm, very modest home and farm in Cottonwood in the Salt Lake Valley. And it was from Cottonwood that they were called to come to Dixie in 1862. And so that gives you a little bit of an overview of how they came to be at Cottonwood, which is right in the first line of the song. Once I lived in Cottonwood and had a little farm. We've got the words of Andrew Carl Larson. Carl Larson was one of the great historians of Utah's Dixie. He wrote two seminal books, one called The Red Hills of November and the other called I Was Called to Dixie. And both of those titles come from George Hicks' song. And in the book, The Red Hills of November, Carl Larson imagined George Hicks' life and maybe those days and hours and moments leading up to the creation of this song. And I want to share this with you in Carl Larson's words. George Hicks sat in profound dejection, nursing a mighty peeve. It was now 2 years since he and his wife Betsy had been in Dixie, and from about every angle he could figure, they were worse off now than when they came. Why had they been uprooted and sent to this God-forsaken place? He was happy at Cottonwood in the Salt Lake Valley, just getting themselves comfortable with a modest house, garden, and farm. As he mused, he likened himself to a plant, well-rooted and healthy, torn up to be transplanted in hot, barren, alkali soil. I am just that, he thought. Why, here in this desolate wilderness, one had to bow his neck to the yoke everlastingly, and then it was a toss-up for the chance of survival. There was no time, no opportunity to read the classics, no inviting the soul, no dining with the muse, nothing at all but grinding, monotonous toil. He looked at his clothing, tattered and worn, his threadbare coat, the one remaining part of his scanty wardrobe which had come with him to Dixie, his shirt of homespun cotton, dyed with the root of the wild dock plant, which was native to the area. Its ugly brown color repelled him. He could have stood the clothing without complaint, miserable as it was, but this being sent without food was the worst. He let his mind wander. He thought of succulent roasting ears and of thick, juicy beefsteaks, of maple syrup and buckwheat cakes and good, wholesome wheat bread, of fried chicken and roast pork. But he was jerked out of his fanciful, pleasant dream world by the gnawing pains of unsatisfied hunger. It was now a good month and a half since he had tasted honest bread. The stuff Betsy made from the sorghum cane seed gave little satisfaction to his craving for food, though he always jokingly told her she could make the best cane seed bread in town. Her carrot-top greens and lucerne greens, he assured her, were calculated to suit the taste of the most fastidious gourmet. They both got what pleasure they could from the joke. They understood each other. Of one thing, thought Hicks rather sardonically, we have enough and to spare. These never-ending sermons with all the scriptures. He thought with affection of his oxen, now with his wagon gone to help get food to keep body and soul together. All these things were bad enough, but as soon as the warm weather came again, and it was not far off, there would be the usual debilitating tussle with the chills and fever. Everybody, it seems, got malaria, even though some sought to evade its evil clutches by closing the doors and windows at night to keep out the air rising from the swamps near the village. So far as he could see, George Hicks thought skeptically, there was nothing to this theory that malaria came from the miasma rising from the slough along the creek and river. Anyway, those who closed their houses fell prey to the disease, along with the unbelievers. But the disease itself was very real, and of all the hardships and privations, this was the very worst. There was little that could be done about it. As he sat there letting his mind wander, as it would, a snatch of music seemed faintly to insinuate itself ingratiatingly into the border of his subconsciousness. He hummed the tune absent-mindedly. He cast it aside to resume his ruminations about the vagaries of his ill fortune. It returned unbidden to patter again half-consciously through his disconnected thoughts. Suddenly, the deep-seated humor in his Irish nature boiled over, and he laughed with sheer pleasure as he saw the humor in his own situation, there beside the tragedy. The laughing muse perched on his shoulder and whispered in his ear. The tune, the Georgia Volunteer, again took possession, and the words began to come, almost effortlessly it seemed. He found writing materials and set the words to music. He tried it over, made a change here and there. Maybe President Snow won't like this, but I'm sure Betsy will. So, Ricky, here we are. We're talking about George Hicks and how Andrew Carl Larson imagined him coming to this point of writing this song. They're living in absolute poverty here in Utah's Dixie, and yet you get the sense that George Hicks is a man, even though he's a frontiers-type pioneer, that he's a man who cares about the arts and cares about words and cares about being able to share things artfully. And here he is sitting here wondering where he's going to get his next meal, and he starts to write a song.
I recently read a quote, "Constraint fosters creativity." And often that it's referred to as lacking options requires you to make creative choices in moving forward. But in this case, I think it applies that it's just his whole constraint in life. It's like he's looking for some way to move forward and probably emotionally or spiritually feeling deficient in hope. And so that's out of those circumstances, this burst forth out of his heart or his soul or his mind as a way for hope to come through his soul out to him. And I love how Carl Larson ends it. He says that he thinks Betsy will like it, which totally makes sense when I think about it. When you want to be creative, often it satisfies something for yourself, but also it's hard not to imagine how this will affect people you care about. And so that desire for him to give her something to laugh about, some joy or hope as being part of that creative process.
And it's interesting to think because he must have been an artist at heart.
Yeah.
And yet, the first and foremost, he had to survive. And so he's grappling with both things. And it's almost like being able to write this song helped him to survive.
Yeah.
Being able to express how he felt in an artful way, in a way that connected with the hearts of others, helped him survive.
Yeah, like there's only so much he could do to produce food or comfort or clothes. And those are essential, crucial parts of life. But then, out of that circumstance, it's like, what else can I do?
Now, we're sitting here talking about this song, but we haven't shared it yet. Our listeners have heard the awesome version that you have created for the theme for our podcast. But maybe what we should do right now, and we'll talk later about that version and how it came to be. But right now, maybe we should take a look at the original song, how he wrote it, and even be able to hear it a cappella from someone as awesome as Hal Cannon, who's one of the great folklorists of the American West, actually one of the great folklorists of the world. He's just a great man with many talents. But one of them is singing, and he was part of the creation of the Deseret String Band 30, 40 years ago. They're a group that began to resurrect the old songs, especially in the Latter-day Saint tradition and the Utah history tradition, and record them and save them for posterity. Hal is a friend of mine, and he's given me the permission to use his a cappella version of Once I Lived in Cottonwood. And as Carl Larson indicated, it's set to the tune of the Georgia Volunteer, which must have been a traditional tune in that day. And apparently that tune was going through, that melody's going through his mind, and then he set these words to it. So there's 12 verses. Carl Larson documents 12 verses in the book, The Red Hills of November. Hal sings 10 of them here, and there's 2 that aren't in this version of his, so maybe we could at least share the words of those afterwards so that our listeners get the whole sense of it. Should we go ahead and listen to that?
Yeah, I'll play it.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. I hooked up Jim and Bolly, all for to make a start. But to leave my house and garden, it almost broke my heart. We moved along quite slowly, oft times I looked behind, for the rocks and hills of Dixie kept rolling through my mind. First we reached the Black Ridge where I broke my wagon down. I couldn't find a carpenter, I was 20 miles from town, so I cut a clumsy cedar and made an awkward slide, but the wagon pulled so heavily, poor Betsy could not ride. While Betsy was a-walkin', I told her to take care, when all upon a sudden she struck a prickly pear. Then she began to blubber and she began to bawl, crying if I was back in Cottonwood I wouldn't have come at all. Next we reached Washington, where we stayed a little while, to see if April showers could make the verdure smile. But at last I was mistaken, and so I went away, for the red hills of November looked just the same in May. I am so weak and hungry now, there's nothing here to cheer, except prophetic sermons, which I very often hear. They hand 'em out by the dozen, and they prove 'em by the book. But me, I'd like some roastin' ears to stay at home and cook. Well, I am so weak and hungry now, I think I'm nearly dead. 'Tis 7 weeks next Sunday since I've tasted bread. Of carrot tops and lucerne greens I've had enough to eat. Boys, I'd like to change my diet to buckwheat cakes and meat. I brought this old coat with me about 2 years ago, and how I'll get another one I'm sure I do not know. May Providence protect me against the wind and wet. These times for me and Betsy I think I'll ne'er forget. This shirt was dyed with wild dock root with greasewood for a set, and I'm sure the colors they will fade when once it does get wet. They said we could grow madder here and indigo so blue, but that proved out a humbug, the story was not true. My wagon went for sorghum seed to make a little bread, and poor old Jim and Bolly long ago are dead. There's just me and Betsy left to hoe the cotton tree. May heaven protect the Dixieite, wherever he may be.
So there you have almost the complete song. There are a couple of verses that are not included there that I want to share here in just a minute. But it's awesome to hear those words and to think of the moment in which they were written and the circumstances in which they were written. Ricky, what are some of your thoughts and feelings as you hear those words sung?
Part of me is gratitude that I don't have to go through that. A lot of empathy. He paints the picture pretty clearly, and it's specific stories about Betsy stepping in a cactus, telling specific anecdotes that are personal to them.
And he talks about his horses, Jim and Bolly. I'm assuming they're horses, they might have been mules, but how personal and close to his heart they are and how much they mean to his existence. And then in that last verse, we hear that they're long gone.
It feels heartbreaking, kind of sad, like the blues.
The blues, that's an interesting thought, because he's sharing this song to really complain and be sad and to express all the hard things they're going through. And yet, I don't know, to me the blues are so uplifting to listen to the music and to hear it done heartfeltly. Is that a contradiction? Or
I feel like the fact that there's a whole genre called the blues, it suggests that there's something in our human nature that's healing about sharing what's difficult and maybe feeling solidarity or some understanding with each other when we both have experienced something hard or are going through something hard. So maybe it's not just coping, but also healing and unifying and motivating, and gives you a sense of purpose or belonging with other people.
yes, that idea of being able to express what's really hard for you, because so often we go through hard times without letting it all out. And I think that a song like this can allow everyone to say, yep, we're having a hard time. And I think that one of the verses, maybe the one that, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, the aftermath of the song, but one of the verses that maybe got George into a little bit of hot water with his ecclesiastical leaders was, I feel so weak and hungry now, there's nothing here to cheer except prophetic sermons, which we very often hear. They will hand them out by dozens and prove them by the book. I'd rather have some roasting ears to stay at home and cook. And so that continual spiritual, physical clash of, yes, we believe, but also we're hungry.
Yeah, and that's interesting that he had those verses that were complaining about, I guess, the lack of aid that they felt they needed. And so the leaders didn't really want that sentiment spreading. But I also think of like the Psalms of David, how a lot of those are the blues. They're mourning songs. And sometimes the whole psalm is just, my life is really hard right now.
And yet they're so beautifully written, they make you feel good.
Yeah, and they're in the scriptures, so it seems there's some degree to that's just part of our human experience, and that the Lord endorses that or lets us embrace it. I also think of the scripture, mourn with those that mourn. In a way, them having a song or an anthem behind their mourning gave them a way to practice that.
And what makes it work is that George Hicks doesn't hold anything back. He tells it like it is. And maybe he did hold some back, but he shared enough for us to really feel like, oh my goodness, that was so hard. I'd like to share the two verses that weren't in what we just listened to. One of them is, when we reached the Sandy, we could not move at all. And I'm assuming that's once they got over the Black Ridge and got into the sandy Dixie sands. For poor old Jim and Bolly began to puff and loll. I whipped and swore a little, but could not make the route. For myself, the team, and Betsy, where all of us give out. So they're almost here, and they're just almost completely ready to end it all.
So that was for their first...
When they first arrived.
So did they know how much farther they had to go, do you think?
From there, they would have been able to see that they were in the region, but my goodness, they even get to Washington, and then they've got to somehow get around the Black Ridge into the St. George Valley. It's just one more obstacle after another, if you think about it that way. And then the other verse that isn't in this version that we heard, but it's interesting and important because it's the verse that you picked to keep in the version that you did for our theme. The hot winds whirl around me and take away my breath. I've had the chills and fever till I'm nearly shook to death. All earthly tribulations are but a moment here. And oh, if I prove faithful, a righteous crown I'll wear. That's a verse that takes you all the way from 0 to infinity.
Yeah, it's like the context of the whole song. Is the last line, is it the last verse where he says, may heaven protect the Dixieite wherever he may be?
Yeah. And Hal sings it as, may heaven protect the Dixieite wherever he may be, although the version in Carl Larson's book says, may heaven help the Dixieite wherever he may be, which I kind of like, heaven help.
Yeah. Given the context and the specific anecdotes, it's almost hard to tell how serious he is about the spiritual themes of the song, or if he's somewhat treating them lightly, or if it's just a mix of both and the way that his sense of humor works.
Based on what you just said, let me share some more of Carl Larson's words, because he writes a kind of epilogue to the story here where he says, aftermath of a pioneer song.
Okay.
These are the words of Carl Larson. Once I Lived in Cottonwood was an immediate success. George Hicks had already attained some local fame as an entertainer, especially as a singer of the folk songs typical of the Latter-day Saint frontier. But never had anything he'd done in this line before so appealed to his friends and neighbors. He sang it at parties and at public gatherings, such as on the 24th of July programs. The people laughed with him as he sang the song in his inimitable Irish way until he became something of a celebrity. The song spread beyond the locality from whence it had sprung, for each community in Dixie recognized in Hicks experiences, something of their own misadventures and trials. They laughed uproariously at his renditions, or perhaps dropped a tear as they relived their experiences in the privacy of their rude dwellings when they returned from these gatherings to their homes. I'll just insert here, we have so much media today, and so we can listen to any song at any moment in any situation. But these people, they did not hear live music unless they were at some kind of gathering where it was performed. And to imagine how much impact one song, one live song that they heard and then carried in their heart as they went back home to their rude dwellings when they returned from these gatherings to their homes. But the authorities were worried about the possible effects of the song, especially that part about the frequency of prophetic sermons and their inadequacy to take the place of good food. And then Hicks was always one to ask embarrassing questions on points of policy and doctrine, and his queries annoyed the authorities until they must have felt his soul was being ensnared by Satan. It was said by some of the old settlers that Hicks lacked faith, while others among them praised him for his inquisitive nature. There seems to be no question of his skepticism, but it is not the province of the historian to assess his faith or his lack of it. And we could talk more, Ricky, about, was he a man of faith? I sure think he was. But he's also an artist who shared truth.
Like one thought is, so he was called to Dixie and he chose to come. So that's a huge act of faith. So regardless of what his words are saying to express his heart artistically, his actions also showed that there's some faith deep down in there that gives purpose to everything he was doing.
That's true. Although he did go almost full circle in the years that followed. There came a point, as we'll read here, where he was excommunicated from the church, but not because of this song. Other things which, in those days, a lot of people were excommunicated. But then he returned in his older age, and that faith, he held to that faith to his dying day. But let me just share here, this is Carl Larson. It's unlikely that the song ever really weakened anyone's faith in the church and its doctrines or in its leaders. Indeed, it's probable that the song had a helpful, strengthening influence. And I think that's an interesting thing because I remember being taught this song when I was a little kid, and it was shared with the whole positive aspect of that. It led them to see the lighter side of a serious situation, and instead of keeping their troubles to themselves to brood and worry over in secret, they brought them out and laughed at them in public, and in the process looked them in the face and wore them down to a size they could cope with. When you talked about the blues, I think that's what the blues do.
Yeah, totally. Expressing what's in your heart and then putting it in a bigger perspective.
But then wearing it down to a size you can cope with. That's a great phrase. So we're honoring Carl Larson here today, too, for his words. Moreover, it could be that the resentments voiced in the song were shared by many who were not endowed with Hicks' effective gift for expression and who were inclined to bear silently the feelings they had. And it is quite possible that the song vicariously gave expression to their own sentiments and became a safety valve for their repressed emotions. In his book, Zealots of Zion, Hoffman Burney says that Hicks was not seriously disciplined by the officials of the church for his good-humored near heresies. And Burney went on to say they even wrote into the manuscript history of the St. George Stake, the song. They put those words into the stake history, the song which so irritated the local church leaders. Burney suggests that an innate good humor tempered Hicks's near heresies, and that there must have been something likable about old Hicks. There is certainly nothing to quarrel with in these observations, Bernie wrote, unless it is the designation of old Hicks, for he was only 29 years old when he penned the lines of the song. An analysis by an unbiased observer of the effects of the song leaves an unmistakable impression of George A. Hicks as a public benefactor. That the people loved the song is attested by its wide acceptance among the people of the West, by whom it is still being sung today. So Carl Larson points out here that the aftermath of the song, and the song really was accepted, it really was popular and beloved. That doesn't change the fact that George Hicks did have his issues with leadership in the church, and he had specific issues with John D. Lee and with Brigham Young. And those were interactions that eventually led to his excommunication. But again, as I said, he transcended all of that, and it all became resolved later in his life. Let me just share here Carl Larson's words. But the fact is that Hicks eventually was excommunicated and remained out of the church until 1921, when he was again baptized and became a member of the church at the advanced age of 88. He died 3 years later. He was very opinionated. He wasn't shy about sharing his opinions, and some of those opinions related to some of the church leaders, and that did lead to him being estranged from the church for a period of time. And I don't know all the details about where he went or where he lived, but I don't believe that he lived all of his life here in Utah's Dixie, but his faith remained with him to the end of his life. So there we have the aftermath of the song. And what I think is awesome, Ricky, is that part of the aftermath of that song came 150 years later. Yeah. When you first heard it, I was working with Phil Tuckett on the documentary film Preservation and Progress, the story of Utah's Dixie. It's a really wonderful, if I say so myself, documentary of the history of this area. You can find it on YouTube, by the way. It documents so many things that we talk about in this podcast. But in the process of producing that film, Phil Tuckett asked Ricky to create a version of I Was Called to Dixie.
As a score, the underscore.
And you weren't familiar with the song at that time. How did you become familiar with it? And tell us that story.
Yeah, so I was commissioned to score that documentary, and if I recall correctly, I think you were the one that had the idea, or maybe it was Phil and you together, but that specific melody as the theme of the documentary. So the underscore had a few variations of the melody, but I remember one morning you hummed it to me the first time and asked if it could make a good underscore. And I thought that would be great. And so then I started ruminating on how to incorporate it as an underscore. And that's all. It was just instrumental, no words. But I remember actually wanting to get a sense of the spirit behind the song and the meaning of it. And we had talked about incorporating some folk instruments that, like mandolin or banjo or fiddle, things that the pioneers might have had. So I was reading the words and familiarizing myself. And after writing all the scores for the documentary, it was just one of those creative moments where the feelings and the thoughts and the ideas come to you and you just have to get them out. As I was listening to the words, the first verse and then the one you mentioned about the hot winds whirl around me came to my mind. And I just felt some sort of connection in a way with George Hicks and thought it would be awesome to honor what he did in creating that song, but honor what he did in his life as being one of the pioneers and trailblazers of this area by telling what, from our perspective, seems like the other half of the story. He talks about being called here, and it was a specific assignment, and it was hard and not something desired. But now so many people feel called here and drawn here, and it is something very desirable to come to this area. So I just imagined, what if he was here now and could write another verse to it? That's the feeling behind the third verse that I wrote.
So the first two verses are from the original?
Yeah, directly from the original.
And then you wrote a third verse to give it context for a modern listener.
Yeah, it's like the same concept of being called to Dixie, but what it all means from today's perspective. And so the song talks about the analogy of planting seeds and how they'll grow up, but they may not come to full fruition in his generation or in his lifetime, but they will for those who follow. And that's us, and we live to see it. So
that's really great. You also wrote a chorus, because the original song doesn't have a chorus. It has 12 verses. Talk about that chorus and how that came to be, because that required a melody that was not in the original Georgia Volunteer.
Yeah, I think it was one of those moments where it just came rather quickly, the words and the melody for the chorus, as something that just ties the whole thing together from both perspectives.
It feels so organic, though. Maybe that was part of what George was going to do, but he never got around to it. But you finished it off at the end.
But yeah, sometimes when, you've probably felt this when you're writing, but you get in the creative flow and it doesn't feel so much like you're producing something, but rather that you're just, I don't know the word for it. Conduit, yeah, or vessel. So I wonder if he was like actually helping me, like from the other side, if he was influencing it. Because I felt inspiration, like something was bringing the ideas to my mind and my heart about what it should be. And that's why I felt like I just needed to get it out. And so I even recorded a demo and sent it to you. And I was like, hey, I just did this because I couldn't resist. Let's see if we can fit it in the documentary. And it actually wasn't a good fit. But then months or maybe a year later, when we started this, then that's when you had the idea, hey, this would be the perfect place for that song.
So, Ricky, when you were creating this version of Once I Lived in Cottonwood, or we also call it I Was Called to Dixie, but as you were doing that, where did you go musically with it, and how did you bring the pieces together for it?
I did a couple of versions for the documentary. One was like a slow piano, supposed to be more sentimental and maybe nostalgic. And then there was one that was orchestral. And then there was the one that people hear on this podcast was derived from one that was more folk and pop sounding. So it starts out with the mandolin. And I just wanted it to be instruments that felt intimate, like what you could hear if you were hearing a pioneer band. So tried to keep it pretty minimal with the production so that the instruments could be prominent.
And you're playing those instruments.
Yeah.
So you're building it on tracks.
Yeah.
Playing the mandolin, playing the banjo.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I don't remember exactly which one I recorded first, but usually I'll record something that gives me a structure of the whole thing, all of the chords throughout, and then envision how I want it to build over time, and then start arranging or recording the various instruments. And
the way I remember it, you were planning on bringing in someone to sing it, but for the demo, you sang it yourself.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I said, Ricky, let's not take anyone else's time. You're perfect. So it's your voice.
Yeah, it is my voice, and I'm not really a singer because in my career I've had the chance to work with lots of good singers, professional singers, and I can tell the difference when I'm in the mixing stage that mine is just a plain voice. But I eventually felt okay with that, particularly for this song. Originally I was thinking, let's find someone that's got like a great Mumford & Sons voice to do it. But I think it does work to have just a plain old voice representing this message.
Maybe one of these days Mumford and Sons will cover.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be?
Yeah, once they feel called to Dixie.
That's great. And also how it builds, because it's pretty simple first, and then it builds a little, and then at the end it brings in, there's some voices that we hear in there as well.
Yeah. And so the background voices are, I always get my wife Julie to help with background vocals. So I sing a few layers, Julie sang a few layers. Grace, my daughter, came and sang, and there might have been a few others, but you just want it to sound like a big group of people. You want to get a few different voices in there.
I think of George Hicks, and you talked about that perhaps he had a role in this, and it wouldn't surprise me, because what you've done with his song is you have perpetuated it into a new era and a new generation. And now hundreds, or I would like to think thousands of people are listening to that song on our podcast. And now by listening to this episode, they're getting the context of what that song is and what it means. And really, it's becoming a song for the ages.
One thing that's cool about the song is that it actually had a function in the community for helping them cope and giving them a sense of identity and culture. So I hope that this version does the same thing, because the one thing they had in common, they were all called to Dixie by assignment, and it was difficult for all of them. And there's been so many people that I've talked to since moving back here in 2020 that have shared essentially the same exact story in different forms, which is that they were in another part of the world and circumstances either forced them to come here, or they had a dream, or they felt called. But so many people today that I've talked to, and I felt it myself when we came back, just feel like this is where they're supposed to be. It's where there's something here for them, and they're called here. So I hope that for us, it can have the similar function of giving us an anthem that summarizes or gives us an identity that we can feel unified with. What it would have done for the pioneers, to do the same thing for us, to tell us about our legacy and what this place means, what our role in relationship with it means, and our role in relationship with everyone else.
The shared feelings and emotions that we have by being here, even though we're all different and we're diverse in so many ways, but we have a common sense of appreciation that we're here.
Yeah, and it's something I don't ever want to forget it myself. Like when we moved back here in 2020, I remember driving for 4 days.
You had lived in Boston for 10 years.
Yeah.
Your 4 children were born there.
And so I had lived here before that, but then after being on the East Coast for 10 years, we drove for 4 days across the whole continent from Boston to here. And I remember as we were driving for 3.5 days, it was basically all the same. And then all of a sudden, I can see in my mind still perfectly, all of a sudden you start to see gradually emerging as you're driving these mountains. And they just get taller and taller as you get closer and closer. And when I saw those, I just felt something so deep in my heart, like that's your home. And it's unique among all the places of the world.
As you're describing that, I think of the phrase, the red hills of November. And that's how I feel whenever I come back in to the St. George Valley, the red hills of November, a phrase that George Hicks wrote almost a century and a half ago.
Actually, once we got here, partially the journey was slightly treacherous with flat tires and things like that. So once we all got here, my whole family, we just got on our knees and we said a prayer. We were so grateful. And I remember the huge contrast of the beauty of this area where you can see for miles. And my eyes weren't used to seeing farther than 50 yards. And you can look up and see all the stars. And so these mountain ranges in this area, I remember thinking, I just never want to forget this feeling of gratitude for the beauty of this area. And also, I never want to forget how much I felt called and how much I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be. So I think having a song that can remind me of that is really helpful for me, for my family, and hopefully others.
That's so beautiful how you've shared that. And I think of all the people who grew up here who now live somewhere else and have made another place home. And it is a wonderful home wherever you are. But that red sand is still in their shoes. And we hear that all the time. And the very last line of his song is, "May heaven help the Dixieite wherever he may be." And that sense of we're all connected to this place, and not just the place, but what it means. And even 150 years later, that line is relevant in that song because we're all over the world, but we're still connected to this place.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the Dixie spirit, I guess is what we call it on this podcast. But what was built, what emerged from those original settlers and being somewhat isolated and the trials that they went through, and how there was a spirit or a culture or an identity that was born out of that. And it's still reverberating through time to today, and also, like you mentioned, reverberating geographically or through space as Dixieites disperse throughout the world.
Good old George Hicks. What a guy. You just have to love him and appreciate that he put those words down to that melody and that we still have it today. And Ricky, through your talents and gifts, you're helping to perpetuate that song forward. I know that our listeners love it. I hear it all the time. And I know that we play it at the end of every podcast, and some people might be getting tired of it. But it's there. You can switch off at the end and not listen to the song. But invariably, I hear people say, I listen all the way through the song every time because it just lifts me. And that's wonderful. Ricky, thank you.
Yeah.
This has been great.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that the song can help conserve the culture that has been and fortify and strengthen it, and help others feel a sense of belonging and a sense of calling to this community. But yeah, thanks for chatting with me.
Thank you.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The hot winds were